Even Jay Leno wouldn't want these in his garage. These three ridiculously stupid cars defy logic with their awful designs, terrible performance, and laughable engineering. You've never seen anything like this. (1958) Zündapp Janus, the car that didn't know which way to go. Germany has a reputation for precision engineering, world-class automobiles, and some of the most advanced vehicles ever built. But every now and then, even the most brilliant minds get it spectacularly wrong. Enter the 1958 Zündapp Janus, a car so baffling in its design that you have to wonder if someone built it as a joke and accidentally put it into production. A car designed by a motorcycle company. What could go wrong? Zündapp, a German company known for making motorcycles, decided to dip its toes into the world of automobiles in the late 1950s. At the time, post-war Europe was hungry for cheap, efficient transportation, and microcars were all the rage. BMW had the Isetta, Messerschmitt had its strange little bubble cars, and Zündapp figured it could join the club with something revolutionary. Unfortunately, their answer to the problem was a car that looked like two mopeds had a head-on collision and somehow fused into one vehicle. The Janus got its name from the Roman god Janus, who had two faces looking in opposite directions. This wasn't just a clever marketing gimmick, it was a painfully literal description of the car itself. Instead of designing a normal microcar, Zündapp and its partner Dornier, yes, the aircraft company, came up with the idea of placing passengers back to back. The driver and front passenger faced forward, while the rear passengers sat facing the back window, staring at traffic behind them. Imagine taking a road trip with your family and having to awkwardly stare at the confused expressions of drivers behind you. Or worse, watching helplessly as an 18-wheeler barrels down toward your tiny 14-horsepower micro car. It was like riding in a glass-walled elevator that never stopped moving. Performance, or lack thereof, speaking of 14 horsepower, the Zündapp Janus was powered by a tiny 248cc single-cylinder engine borrowed from one of the company's motorcycles. To call it underpowered would be an insult to other underpowered cars. With a top speed of around 50 mph in 80 km, and that's assuming you had a strong tailwind. This was not a vehicle you wanted to take on the Autobahn. Even worse, it had just 3 gears, which meant accelerating was more of a suggestion than an actual capability. Going uphill, you might as well get out and push. Because the engine was mounted in the middle of the car, weight distribution was almost perfectly balanced. But that didn't help much. The Janus had an unnerving tendency to lean like a drunken sailor in corners, and if you brake too hard, you'd get the sensation that the car might just flip over backward. Flimsy build quality and odd design choices. Since Zündapp specialized in motorcycles, its engineers had no real experience designing cars. The result? A flimsy, tin can-like body that felt more like an oversized scooter than a car. The front and rear were identical, meaning there was no real front or back at first glance, adding to the confusion. One of the car's strangest features was its entry system. Instead of doors on the sides like a normal vehicle, both the front and rear passengers entered through the front and back hatches, which folded outward. It was a clever space-saving idea, but in reality, it just made getting in and out an absolute nightmare, especially if someone parked too close to you. Oh, and there was no trunk, not even a tiny storage compartment. If you wanted to bring anything larger than a handbag, you had to either hold it in your lap or strap it to the roof like some kind of microcar outlaw. A commercial disaster. Unsurprisingly, the Zündapp Janus was a total failure. Zündapp had hoped to produce around 50,000 units per year, but in reality they sold only 6,902 before the company realized that maybe they should just stick to motorcycles. It wasn't just that the Janus was slow, underpowered, and oddly designed, it was also too expensive for what it offered. For just a little more money, buyers could get a real car, like the Volkswagen Beetle, which had more power, better engineering, and most importantly, all the seats faced forward. After the Janus debacle, Zündapp completely abandoned the idea of making cars and went back to doing what it did best, building motorcycles. Jay Leno's Take Jay Leno, a man who owns some of the weirdest cars in history, has openly laughed at the Zündapp Janus. While he appreciates its uniqueness, he's joked that it's the only car where half the passengers regret getting in before the trip even starts. He also pointed out that while it's certainly a collector's curiosity, driving one today is terrifying. Between the anemic engine, the back-facing seats, and the general feeling of impending disaster, it's not exactly a car you'd want to take out for a Sunday drive. 1970. AMC Gremlin, the compact car that looked like an afterthought. American Motors Corporation, AMC, had a habit of thinking outside the box. Sometimes that led to brilliant ideas, like the Jeep Cherokee. Other times, well, it led to the AMC Gremlin, a car that looked like someone had taken a normal vehicle, cut it in half with a chainsaw, and called it a day. AMC introduced the Gremlin in 1970 as a response to the growing demand for smaller, fuel-efficient cars. It was meant to compete with compact imports like the Volkswagen Beetle and the Toyota Corolla. But instead of designing a brand new vehicle, AMC took a shortcut, literally, half a car full of problems. The Gremlin was a regular AMC Hornet, with the rear end chopped off. AMC's designers were working with a tight budget, so instead of crafting a sleek new body, they simply lopped off the back of an existing car, creating a design that looked both rushed and confused. From the front, it had the proportions of a normal compact car, long hood, sloping windshield, and traditional muscle car-inspired front grille. But then you walked around to the back, and suddenly it was as if someone had stolen the trunk. The Gremlin's bizarre, squared-off rear end made it look unfinished, almost like a factory mistake that somehow ended up in showrooms. Mechanical mayhem. If the strange design weren't enough, the Gremlin also had serious reliability issues. Chief among them was a carburetor that had a nasty habit of catching fire. You could be driving along, minding your business, and suddenly, poof, your engine bay was on fire. The handling was also suspect at best. Thanks to its weird proportions, the rear wheels had less weight on them than the front, making the car prone to sliding or fishtailing if you took a turn too quickly. This was particularly dangerous in wet weather, where the Gremlin's tail-happy nature could send you spinning off the road. Muscle car or economy car. AMC marketed the Gremlin as a compact car with a sporty attitude, but in reality, it was neither an economy car nor a muscle car. It just kind of existed in a strange middle ground. The base model came with a tiny 2.0L four-cylinder engine making a meager 70 horsepower, which made acceleration feel like a test of patience. But for those who wanted more power and didn't mind the constant mechanical issues, AMC offered the Gremlin with a 5.0L V8, which was completely unnecessary for such a small car, but undeniably fun when it worked. The V8 version was quick in a straight line, but thanks to its awkward design and poor weight distribution, it handled like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. The Gremlin's weird popularity. Despite all of its flaws, the AMC Gremlin somehow found an audience. It was one of the cheapest cars on the market when it launched, starting at just $1,879, which was nearly $300 less than a Volkswagen Beetle. Young buyers in particular were drawn to its quirky design and cheap price tag, and it developed a bit of a cult following. Even today, the Gremlin has a small but loyal fan base, with collectors embracing its weirdness. Some have even restored and modified them into legitimate performance cars, proving that even the ugliest, most poorly engineered vehicles can still have potential, if you're willing to put in the work. Jay Leno's Take Jay Leno, who owns just about every weird car ever made, has joked that the Gremlin looks like it was designed on a Friday at 4:55 p.m., a comment that perfectly captures its rushed, last-minute aesthetic. Despite that, Leno admits he has a soft spot for the car. In a way, it represents AMC's scrappy underdog mentality, a company that knew it couldn't beat Ford or GM at their own game, so it decided to get weird instead. The Gremlin in pop culture. If you've ever watched a movie or TV show set in the 1970s, you've probably seen a Gremlin. Thanks to its distinct, awkward shape, it became a go-to vehicle for Hollywood whenever they needed to depict a cheap, beat-up, or hilariously bad car. Some of its most famous appearances include Wayne's World, 1992. Garth Algar drove a blue 1976 Gremlin with flames on the side, Because of course he did. The Cannonball Run, 1981, featured a heavily modified Gremlin that somehow managed to keep up with exotic supercars. Dumb and Dumber, 1994, one of the background cars in multiple scenes, fitting the movie's theme of lovable stupidity. The end of the Gremlin. AMC produced the Gremlin from 1970 to 1978, after which it was replaced by the AMC Spirit. Despite selling nearly 700,000 units, it never truly shook its reputation as an oddball failure. Today, the Gremlin is remembered as one of the weirdest cars of its era, a bizarre mix of economy car, muscle car, and accidental joke that somehow made it into production. And for that reason alone, it's earned its place in automotive history. 1989. Trabant 601, the East German plastic time capsule. For car lovers, the late 1980s meant at Ferrari Testarossas, Porsche 911 turbos, and BMW M3s roaring down the Autobahn. But if you lived in East Germany, your reality was quite different. Instead of sleek European engineering, you got the Trabant 601, a car so outdated and underpowered that it felt more like a glorified go-kart than an actual automobile. A car made of, what now? Most cars are made of steel or aluminum, but not the Trabant 601. Oh no, that would be too normal. Instead, the body panels were crafted from Duroplast, a strange mix of plastic, cotton waste, and compressed paper pulp. The upside? It was cheap and didn't rust. The downside? Well, it was plastic and paper. That meant the Trabant was dangerously flimsy. In a collision, the body wouldn't crumple. It would shatter into shards. If you were unlucky enough to be in an accident, you weren't walking away unscathed. And no, it wasn't recyclable. So despite looking like an eco-friendly experiment, it was an environmental nightmare. Just like everything else about this car. The mighty, pathetic engine under the hood, if you can even call it that, was a tiny 594cc two-stroke engine making a blistering 26 horsepower. To put that into perspective, a modern riding lawnmower can have more power. The Trabant's engine wasn't just weak, it was also a two-stroke nightmare, meaning you had to mix oil with your fuel manually. If you got the ratio wrong, it would either choke on too much oil or burn itself out from lack of lubrication. And then there was the smoke. Every time you fired up a Trabant, it belched out a thick blue cloud that could easily be mistaken for an industrial accident. If you saw a Trabant coming, you smelled it before you heard it. And you definitely heard it, because the engine screamed like a dying chainsaw. Speed? What speed? The Trabant's official 0-60 mph time was, well, let's just say it didn't have one because it couldn't reach 60 mph under normal conditions. The top speed? A laughable 65 mph. That's if you were lucky enough to find a long enough road, no headwind, and no passengers weighing it down. If you had more than one person in the car, forget about it. Uphill? Better start pushing. The 10-year waiting list. Despite being one of the worst cars ever made, the Trabant 601 was wildly popular in East Germany, not because people liked it, but because they had no other choice. If you wanted one, you had to place an order years in advance. Some people waited over a decade for their Trabant to be delivered. Imagine ordering a car in 1979 and finally getting it in 1989, only to realize that it was a design from 1964 with zero updates. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, thousands of Trabant owners abandoned them in the streets as they fled to the West, where even the cheapest Volkswagen felt like a Rolls-Royce in comparison. Jay Leno's Take Jay Leno, who has driven almost every car imaginable, has joked that the Trabant makes a Yugo look like a Ferrari. He even brought one onto his show, revved it up, and watched as a massive cloud of blue smoke filled the air. To the horror of his studio audience, the death of the Trabant. When East and West Germany reunited, no one wanted a Trabant anymore. Within months, scrapyards were filled with them. Some were repurposed into flower pots, others were converted into novelty barbecues, and a few were hilariously used as boats, which, considering their plastic bodies, actually worked. Production finally ended in 1990, sealing its fate as one of the most infamous cars of all time, the Trabant's legacy. Believe it or not, the Trabant has a cult following today. Enthusiasts see it as a quirky, historical artifact from a lost era. Some even restore them, not because they're great cars, but because they represent a symbol of resilience in a time when East Germans had to make do with what little they had. Today, if you spot a Trabant at a car show, it's more of a museum piece than a mode of the transport. And if you ever drive one, just make sure to bring extra oil, a gas mask, and a lot of patience. You'll need all three.